The gun was already pressed against Harlan Sutton's chest when Louise Graves looked him in the eye and said the words that would change everything between them. She had found the wanted poster. She had found the leather satchel hidden beneath the floorboards of the barn. She had found the letters, ink-stained and damning, tied with a cord that smelled of gunpowder and old grief. And she had found him standing right there in the amber lantern light, watching her from the barn doorway with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she had raised the Colt revolver she had pulled from beneath her pillow with both hands steady and her jaw set like iron. "Tell me it is not true," she said. Her voice did not shake. That was the thing about Louise Graves. Even when the ground was crumbling beneath her feet, her voice never shook. "Tell me that you are not Harlan Sutton, wanted in 3 territories for robbery, accessory to murder, and the destruction of the Aldgate rail line." He did not deny it. He did not reach for the revolver at his own hip. He simply looked at her across that lantern-lit space with an expression so complicated it seemed to contain an entire lifetime of regret. And then he said, very quietly, "I am not a good man, Louise." And Louise Graves, who had crossed half the country on a rattling stagecoach, who had buried her father in a shallow grave on the Kansas plain, who had fought drought and locusts and creditors and the grinding loneliness of the frontier, lowered the revolver 2 inches and said, "I will be the judge of that." It had begun 4 months earlier in the spring of 1882, when the town of Caldwell Creek, Texas, was still half mud and half ambition. Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of the hill country like something a man had dropped by accident and decided not to pick up. It had a main street of perhaps a dozen buildings, a water tower that leaned slightly east, a livery stable that smelled exactly as one would expect a livery stable to smell, a general store owned by a widow named Mrs. Holt who kept her prices fair and her opinions to herself, a saloon called the Dusty Anchor, which struck everyone as an odd name for a saloon in a landlocked territory, but which no one had ever bothered to change, and a small whitewashed building at the end of the street that served as both the sheriff's office and the town jail. The sheriff was a man named Aldous Breckenridge, 62 years old, with a white mustache and a limp from a horse kick he had received in 1871. He was a decent man in most respects and a thoroughly ineffective law officer in all others. He had never drawn his weapon in office. He had never needed to, because Caldwell Creek had never been the kind of town that attracted serious trouble, until the spring of 1882. Louise Graves arrived in Caldwell Creek on the 3rd of April aboard the overland stage, carrying a single carpet bag, a worn leather journal, and what remained of her inheritance, which amounted to $37, and a pocket watch that had belonged to her father. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, gray-eyed, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and possessed of the kind of self-contained composure that some people mistook for coldness. She was not cold. She had simply learned, early and thoroughly, that the world did not reward visible fear. Her father, Thomas Graves, had left her the deed to a homestead 40 acres east of Caldwell Creek. He had purchased it sight unseen from a land agent in St. Louis before his health had failed him entirely, and he had pressed the deed into Louise's hands on his deathbed with a certainty that it was the best thing he could do for her. "The frontier is still open," he had told her, wheezing against his pillows. "A woman with land and the will to work it can make her own life." He had been right about the frontier being open. He had been somewhat optimistic about the land itself. The 40 acres east of Caldwell Creek were dry, rocky, and stubborn. The previous owner had managed to coax a kitchen garden and a small wheat field from it before abandoning the enterprise entirely, and what remained was a weathered 2-room cabin, a barn that had seen better decades, a well that still gave clean water, and soil that would need a season of careful work before it would give anything back. Louise walked the property on her first afternoon, her boots collecting the red dust, and made a list in her leather journal of what needed doing. It was a very long list. She did not panic. She set the journal aside, rolled up her sleeves, and began. She hired a hand from town, a young man of 20 named Cobb Aldersley, freckled and good-natured, who knew enough about crops and fencing to be genuinely useful. She negotiated credit at the general store with Mrs. Holt, who studied her for a long moment and then extended it without additional comment. She introduced herself to Sheriff Breckenridge, who tipped his hat and told her she was brave for a woman alone, which she accepted without visible reaction, though she privately found the framing somewhat unnecessary. She planted kitchen garden seedlings. She repaired fencing. She learned the rhythms of the well. She wrote letters back east to no one in particular because there was no one left back east who was hers. And in the 4th week of April, when she was hauling lumber from the barn to repair the roof of the chicken coop, Harlan Sutton rode onto her property. She did not know his name yet. She saw a man on a dark bay horse coming down the track from the north, riding at a measured pace that suggested someone who was deliberately not in a hurry, and she put down the lumber and stood with her hand resting on the handle of the work axe she had been using on a stubborn fence post, watching him come. He was perhaps 32 or 33, lean and dark, with a week's worth of beard and trail dust on everything. He wore a flat-brimmed hat, dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a gun belt that sat low on his hip with the ease of something long habituated. He had dark eyes set beneath straight brows, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stubborn material as Louise's 40 acres, and an expression that was careful and neutral in the particular way of a man who had learned to give nothing away. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance and looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I am looking for work," he said. "I was told in town they might know of something at a homestead going east." Louise studied him. "Who told you that?" "Man at the livery said a woman had taken the Graves property and was working it alone." "I have a hand," she said. "One hand for 40 acres is not much," he replied, not with arrogance but with a simple, factual delivery that she found honest. She looked at him for another moment. There was nothing overtly alarming about him. There was also something about him that was deeply, carefully closed off, like a room with the curtains drawn. She noted that. She noted his hands, which were calloused in the way of someone who had done real physical work, not just carrying a weapon. She noted that he had not once let his eyes wander to anything except her face and the immediate vicinity, which was the behavior of someone who was either very disciplined or who had something specific to focus on. "I cannot pay much," she said. "I am not asking for much. A fair wage, meals, and a place to sleep in the barn. I do not drink, I do not gamble, I will not make you any trouble." The last sentence was said with a particular emphasis that she would only understand much later. "What is your name?" she asked. He hesitated, and it was such a brief hesitation that she almost missed it. "Sutton," he said. "Harlan Sutton." She extended her hand. "Louise Graves." He shook it. His grip was firm without being performative. His skin was warm. "You can start tomorrow," she said. "I will show you the barn this afternoon." She did not know that she had just given shelter to a man with a wanted poster in 4 separate counties. She did not know that he had ridden specifically to Caldwell Creek for reasons that had nothing to do with available work and everything to do with a secret he was carrying like a stone in his chest. She did not know any of that. What she knew was that the roof of the chicken coop still needed fixing, that she had $32 left to her name, and that there was something about Harlan Sutton's eyes that made her feel, in some strange, deep way, like she had been standing alone for a very long time and had not fully realized it until this moment. He fixed the chicken coop roof the next morning before she had finished making coffee. She came out onto the porch with 2 tin cups and found him already up on the roof, moving with a quiet efficiency, hammering in the new boards she had cut the day before with a steadiness that was almost musical. He climbed down when he heard her on the steps and accepted the cup with a simple nod of thanks. They stood for a moment in the early morning cool, the sky going pink and gold above the hills, and said nothing. It was a comfortable silence, which surprised her. Over the following weeks, she learned things about him slowly, the way you learn a new landscape, piece by piece. He was good with horses, genuinely good, with the kind of patience that animals recognized and responded to. He was methodical and thorough in his work. He ate whatever she cooked without complaint and offered genuine, specific appreciation when something was particularly good. He read, which surprised her when she found him in the barn one evening with a worn copy of a Charles Dickens novel open in his hands, and they had their first real conversation over the question of whether Dickens was essentially a sentimentalist or a genuine social critic, and she found that his mind was sharp, and his opinions were grounded in actual thought rather than performance. He did not talk about himself. She noticed this, of course. She was not a naive woman. She noticed the way he deflected personal questions with a skill that was clearly practiced. She noticed the way he was always positioned with his back to something solid when they were outside. She noticed that he slept lightly, because twice she had come to the barn early and found him already awake and dressed at hours when the sun was barely a rumor. She noticed all of these things and set them aside, because what she also noticed was that he was kind. Not kind in an obvious, performed way. Kind in the way that shows itself in small actions when no one is watching to credit it. She noticed that he had repaired a section of fence along the north pasture that she had not asked him to repair, and that was not visible from the house. She noticed that when young Cobb Aldersley was struggling with a particularly stubborn section of rock in the wheat field, Harlan had come to help without comment and without making the boy feel incompetent. She noticed that he had left a small bunch of wild columbines, the deep blue and gold ones that grew along the creek, on the kitchen windowsill one morning without any explanation, and that when she had looked at him, he had simply looked back with that steady, unreadable expression and resumed his breakfast. She noticed all of this, and something in her chest began to do something it had not done in a very long time. The trouble came from the east, as trouble often did in 1882. A man named Doyle Crest rode into Caldwell Creek in the second week of May, and he rode in like a man who owned the road and everything adjacent to it. He was perhaps 45, broad through the chest, with pale eyes and a silver badge on his coat that identified him as a federal marshal from the Kansas office. He had 2 deputies with him, younger men with the specific kind of emptiness in their eyes that suggested they were hired for their lack of conscience, rather than their abundance of skill. Crest went first to Sheriff Breckenridge. Louise heard about this from Mrs. Holt, who heard it from the barber, who had heard the conversation through the thin wall that separated his shop from the sheriff's office. Crest was looking for a fugitive, a man connected to the Aldgate Railroad job of 1881, in which a survey train had been derailed and 3 men had died, including a federal surveyor. He had information suggesting the fugitive had come south into Texas. Louise heard this story while buying flour and did not at that moment connect it to anything or anyone. She thanked Mrs. Holt and went home. That evening, Harlan was quiet at supper in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was settled and present. This quiet had an edge to it, a watchfulness that she had not seen before, or rather that she recognized now as the thing that had always been there beneath the surface, which she had been choosing not to examine too closely. "There is a federal marshal in town," she said, putting down her fork and looking at him directly. He did not look up for a moment. Then he did. His eyes met hers with an expression that was complicated in ways she did not fully have the language for yet. "I heard," he said. "Is he looking for you?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "I see," she said. "Louise." He said her name and then stopped, and she could see him working through something behind those dark eyes, calculating distances and angles in a way that was not about geography. "You do not have to explain anything tonight," she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it, that she was not afraid, that what she felt was something more complex and more urgent than fear. "But I think you are going to need to explain something eventually." He nodded slowly. "I know." He helped her clear the table, as he always did, and he said good night, and he went to the barn. And she lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of the night and trying to understand what she felt, which was not betrayal yet and was not trust exactly either, but was something in between, something that had its own weight and its own gravity. 3 days later, Doyle Crest came to her farm. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard the hoofbeats, and she straightened and turned to find Crest and one of his deputies pulling up at her gate. She wiped her hands on her work apron and walked to meet them with the same deliberate calm she brought to everything. "Miss Graves." Crest had a voice like gravel in a tin can, rough and metallic. "Federal Marshal Doyle Crest, Kansas office. I am making inquiries in the area regarding a wanted fugitive. Sheriff Breckenridge mentioned a marshal had arrived," she said. "How can I help you? We have reason to believe a man named Harlan Sutton may have come through this area, possibly within the last month or two." He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out. It was a wanted poster. She took it and looked at it. The drawing was rough, as wanted poster drawings always were, but there was no denying the line of the jaw, the set of the eyes. The name read Harlan, Sutton, in bold block letters. Beneath the name were the charges: robbery, accessory to murder, destruction of federal property, and a sum, $500 reward, dead or alive. Louise looked at the poster for what she calculated was exactly the correct amount of time, neither too brief nor too long, and then she handed it back. "I have not seen this man," she said. She did not know why she said it. She knew that it was a lie and that lying to a federal officer was a serious matter. She knew that somewhere behind the barn, Harlan was likely watching this exchange from a concealed position, because he was the kind of man who would know to do that. She knew all of this, and she said it anyway, in a calm and level voice that gave nothing away. Crest looked at her with those pale eyes for a moment. "If you do see anything suspicious, I would encourage you to come straight to the sheriff's office," he said. "This is a dangerous man, Miss Graves, a man who does not hesitate when his freedom is threatened." "Thank you, Marshal," she said. She watched them ride away, and then she walked to the barn and went inside and found Harlan standing against the far wall in the shadows, exactly where she had expected him to be, with his hand on his revolver and his face completely still. "I lied for you," she said. "I am going to need you to tell me why I did that." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You deserve the truth." He told her most of it that afternoon, sitting in the barn with the warm hay and horse smell around them, and the sunlight coming in slanted through the gaps in the boards. He told her about the Aldgate Railroad job, about how he had been part of a crew hired by a man named Vernon Cade, who had contracted them to do what he had called survey disruption, interference with a railroad survey that was cutting through land that Cade claimed was his. He told her that he had not known at the time that 3 men would die in the derailment. He told her that when he had found out, he had tried to hold Cade accountable through legitimate means, and had discovered very quickly that Vernon Cade had the kind of connections that made legitimate means unavailable. He told her that Doyle Crest, the federal marshal currently looking for him, had been on Cade's payroll for the better part of 2 years. "Crest is not trying to bring me to justice," Harlan said. "He is trying to make sure I do not live long enough to testify to what I know about Vernon Cade and the railroad contract fraud he perpetrated on the federal government. The wanted poster is real. My involvement in the Aldgate job is real. But the deaths are on Cade's head, not mine, and Crest knows it." Louise absorbed this. "Where is Vernon Cade now?" "He is in St. Louis. He has been under federal investigation for the past 8 months, but the investigation keeps stalling because the lead investigator keeps losing his evidence. I have proof of what Cade ordered. I have letters. I have been carrying them for 14 months trying to figure out how to get them to someone I could trust." "What kind of proof?" He pulled the satchel from beneath a loose board in the barn floor, the same satchel she would later find when everything came to its crisis point. He opened it and showed her the letters, carefully preserved, and a ledger with Cade's handwriting documenting the payments, the plan, the ordered outcome. "There is a federal investigator named Harold Marsh in the Austin office," Harlan said. "He is not Cade's man. I have been told he is honest. If I could get this evidence to him, it might be enough." "Why have you not gone to him already?" "Because Crest has been behind me every step of the way. Every time I have come close to a city with a federal office, he has been there. He has informants. He is very good at this." He paused. "I came to Caldwell Creek because I needed time. I needed somewhere quiet enough to think and plan, and small enough that Crest would not expect to find me here. I did not intend to stay more than a week or two." He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was new, something that sat behind the careful neutrality like a candle behind glass. "I did not intend for any of this," he said, and she understood from the weight of those words that he was not just talking about the evidence and the marshal and the fugitive's life. He was talking about her. She held his gaze and felt the thing in her chest do that complicated, significant thing again. "So what do we do now?" she said. The word "we" was intentional. She saw him register it, saw something shift in his eyes, and she held her ground and let it be intentional. He said, "I have been thinking about that." Over the following 2 weeks they made a plan. It was Louise who thought of the clearest path. Harold Marsh in the Austin federal office had an established reputation, and Austin was 3 days' ride from Caldwell Creek. The problem was Crest, who had settled his deputies in town and showed no sign of leaving. The solution, Louise argued, was misdirection. Young Cobb Aldersley, who had by this point been told enough of the truth to understand the stakes, and who had the good moral instinct to side firmly against a crooked marshal, agreed to ride east toward San Antonio on a visible, unhurried trajectory, letting himself be seen on the road, which would suggest to Crest's informants that if anyone was helping a fugitive escape, they were going east, not south toward Austin. Meanwhile, Louise would stay on the farm with complete normalcy, accepting a visit from Crest if he returned, acting entirely settled, while Harlan rode at night by a route they had mapped together from her father's old Texas survey maps. It was a reasonable plan. It nearly worked. On the night Harlan was supposed to leave, which was a Thursday in late May when the moon was new and the dark would be deep, Crest came back to the farm. He came at 9 in the evening, which was unusual. He came alone, which was alarming. He came through the back of the property rather than the front gate, which was terrifying. Louise was in the kitchen when she heard the back door, and she had her father's old Colt revolver in her hand before she had fully processed the sound, moving into the shadow of the doorway to the parlor before the door swung open and Crest stepped inside. He held a lantern in one hand and his revolver in the other, and he looked around the kitchen with those pale eyes and then settled on her with an expression that was completely devoid of the professional courtesy he had displayed before. "I know he is here," Crest said. "There is no one here but me," Louise said. She was very, very calm. "I am going to search the barn. You are going to need a warrant for that. Miss Graves." He said her name with a patience that was not gentle. "You do not want to be involved in this. You are a woman alone trying to make something of 40 acres of difficult land. That is admirable. Do not throw it away for a man who is going to hang regardless of what you do." "I told you before," she said. "I have not seen the man you are looking for." There was a silence, and in that silence she heard the back door of the barn close, a sound that would have been inaudible if not for the absolute stillness of the night, and she knew that Harlan was still here and had just come inside the barn from the pasture side, and that if Crest went to the barn it would all come apart. She made a decision. "Marshal," she said, "I think you are here because Vernon Cade sent you." Everything stopped. Crest went very still in a way that told her everything she needed to know about how accurate she was. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said. "I think you do," she said. "I think Vernon Cade has been paying you to make sure Harlan Sutton does not reach an honest federal investigator with what he knows. I think the wanted poster is real, but the intent behind your pursuit of it is not about justice. And I think," she said, keeping her voice absolutely level, that you would be very unwise to hurt me, because I have already sent a letter to Harold Marsh in the Austin office informing him of the situation, and if anything happens to me, he will be asking questions you would find very difficult to answer." She had not sent any such letter. She was a very good liar when the situation demanded it. Crest looked at her for a very long moment, and she watched him calculate, watched him weigh his options with those cold, pale eyes, and she held herself perfectly still and let nothing show. He left. He walked back out through the kitchen door and he left, and she listened to his horse go and did not move for a full 2 minutes after the sound had faded. Then she went to the barn. Harlan was standing just inside the barn door and he had heard everything. She could tell from his face. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not quite categorize, something that contained both awe and something rawer and more vulnerable than anything she had seen from him. "You lied," he said. "Yes," she said. "You put yourself in danger for me." "It was a calculated risk," she said, which was true. "Louise." He said her name again in that way he had, as if the word itself was something he was handling carefully. "I have to go tonight, right now. Crest is going to reassess and come back." "I know," she said. "The horse is ready. I have the satchel." She had the satchel in her hand. She had retrieved it from beneath the barn floor in the time between Crest leaving and coming to find Harlan, because she had understood that there would be no more waiting. He took the satchel from her. Their hands touched in the exchange, and neither of them moved away from that contact for a moment. "I will come back," he said. "I know," she said again. "I mean it." "I know that too," she said, and then, because she was Louise Graves and she did not do anything halfway, she said, "You had better." He rode out through the south pasture gate into the dark, and she watched him go, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself, in the privacy and quiet of her own house, to feel every complicated and terrifying thing she had been holding at bay. The days after he left were some of the harder ones. Crest came back the next morning, this time with both his deputies, and he searched the barn and the house with a thoroughness that was barely legal and entirely unpleasant. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. He was coldly angry in a way that expressed itself as extreme formality, and he left without a word. Louise repaired the mess his deputies had made of her kitchen and went back to her work. She heard nothing for 6 days. On the 7th day, Cobb Aldersley came back from his decoy ride east, and he brought news from the road. There was talk in the next county of a federal investigation out of Austin that had suddenly gained momentum, something about new evidence in the Aldgate Railroad case, and a St. Louis man of some prominence facing serious federal scrutiny. The name Vernon Cade was being mentioned. There was also talk of a federal marshal from the Kansas office being recalled for internal review. Louise sat with this information and felt something in her chest loosen. 2 days after that, she was in the kitchen garden when she heard hoofbeats on the north track. She straightened, shading her eyes, and saw the dark bay horse and the man on it, trail dusty and unhurried, coming down toward her gate with that measured pace that she now recognized as distinctly his. She stood very still while he rode in and dismounted and came through the gate, and she waited until he was close enough that she could see his face clearly, and she said, "Well." "Marsh had enough to open a federal case against Cade," he said. "The investigation is going forward. Cade has been brought in for questioning in St. Louis. Crest has been recalled, as you probably already heard." "I heard something," she said. "The charges against me are being reviewed as part of the larger case. Marsh believes there are grounds for dismissal given my cooperation and the evidence I provided. It will take time to resolve officially, but—" He paused. "He let me leave Austin." "No one is riding after me," she nodded. She looked at him, standing there in her garden with the late morning sun on his face and the dust of 3 days riding on his clothes, and she felt something so large and so clear that it was almost frightening. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." "You did," she agreed. "Louise." He was looking at her with that expression she had come to recognize, the one that was complicated and contained and carried something significant in it. "I want to say something." "Then say it," she said. I came here with secrets. I came here with a hidden motive, a dark past, and a situation that put you in danger that you had not asked for and did not deserve. I lied to you by omission when I took work on this farm. I gave you a reason to be very angry with me. Yes, she said. He stopped and then continued more quietly. I also did not anticipate what it would be to spend 6 weeks in your company. I did not anticipate you, and I think you deserve to know that. She took a step toward him. Is that everything? No, he said. The other thing is that I want to stay, if you will have me, not as a hand, as. He paused, and for the first time she saw something uncertain in him, something young and careful and afraid of the answer. As something else. Louise Graves looked at Harlan Sutton, who was a man with a dark past and a complicated history and secrets that had almost cost her everything, who had fixed her chicken coop roof before she was awake, who had left columbines on her windowsill, who had read Dickens in the barn and argued thoughtfully about social criticism, who had ridden 3 days to a federal office carrying evidence that could have gotten him killed, and she said, yes, just that, just yes. He crossed the remaining distance between them, and when he took her face in his hands, she felt the roughness of his calloused palms and the gentleness of the gesture simultaneously. And when he kissed her, she had the profound and specific sensation of recognizing something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. They stayed in the garden, and the sun moved, and the columbines down by the creek were blooming, and neither of them was particularly in a hurry. The summer unfolded in the way of things that are both tentative and inevitable. They moved carefully, the way two people do who have both been alone a long time and have developed a healthy respect for the weight of trust. But carefully is not the same as slowly, and between them there was a current of feeling that had been building for 2 months and did not require any further delay to be real. He was still sleeping in the barn, initially, which was the correct and proper arrangement, and which both of them understood would not be the permanent one. He was over for meals every morning and every evening. They fell into a rhythm of talking that felt as natural as breathing. She told him about her father, about the years in St. Louis, about the particular loneliness of being a capable and independent woman in an age and place that was not entirely sure what to do with capable and independent women. He told her, in pieces and over time, more of his own history. He was from Missouri originally, the son of a farmer who had lost everything in the aftermath of the war, and he had been 22 when he had first ended up working for men whose methods were questionable, because the legitimate work had dried up, and he had been too proud and too desperate to go back to his family empty-handed. He had spent the better part of a decade on the edge of the law, sometimes crossing it for men like Vernon Cade, and he had spent the last 3 years trying to work his way back towards something he could respect when he looked in the mirror. I have done things I am not proud of, he said one evening, and she said, so have I, because it was true, and because she wanted him to understand that she was not making judgments from a height she had not earned. In July, the federal case against Vernon Cade was formally filed in the St. Louis court, and Harold Marsh sent a letter to Harlan informing him that his cooperation had been recognized and that the charges against him were being formally suspended pending the outcome of the Cade case, with a strong likelihood of full dismissal. It was not a pardon, not yet, but it was the closest thing to it, and it meant that Harlan Sutton could wake up in the morning without listening for the sound of approaching riders with a particular quality of urgency to their pace. That evening he came to the kitchen door with the letter in his hand, and she read it at the table, and then she looked up at him and said, "How does it feel?" He thought about it for a moment. "Like I can breathe," he said. She put the letter down and stood up and walked to him, and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and they stood like that for a while in the kitchen doorway with the summer dark outside and the lamp warm behind them. "I need to tell you something," he said after a while. "Tell me," she said against his shoulder. "I love you," he said. "I should have said it sooner, but I needed." He paused. "I needed to not have the thing with Crest and the charges and all of it hanging over the saying of it. I needed to say it as something free, not something desperate or contingent. She pulled back enough to look at him. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." "Have you?" He looked at her with those dark eyes. "You are not as unreadable as you think," she said. And he said, "And I love you too," she said. "I have for some time, probably since you argued with me about Dickens." He laughed. It was a real laugh, full and free, and it transformed his face in a way that made her feel almost dizzy, and she decided then that making him laugh was something she intended to invest considerable effort in for the foreseeable future. In August, they had a conversation about the future with the specificity that two practical people allow themselves when they have acknowledged what they feel for each other and are ready to build something real from it. Louise wanted to stay on the 40 acres. She had put too much work into it, too much of herself to leave it. The wheat field was doing better than she had hoped. The kitchen garden was producing enough to sell the surplus at the market in town, which was a small income but a real one. She had plans for the property that would take years and work and patience, and all three of those things were things she had. Harlan had no particular pull toward anywhere else. His roots in Missouri had been severed for more than a decade, and the decade since had not given him new roots. What it had given him was skills in construction and farming and with horses, and a bone-deep understanding of what he wanted from whatever life remained to him, which was something honest and solid and real. "I will stay," he said, "if you are asking me to." "I am asking you to," she said. They were married in September of 1882, in the whitewashed church that had been built at the edge of town the previous spring by a congregation of 15 families and a visiting minister named Reverend Calloway, who made the ride down from Abilene every 3 weeks and who was pleased to perform the ceremony. Mrs. Holt came, which mattered to Louise. Cobb Aldersley was there, beaming and sunburned, and he had pressed his one good shirt for the occasion. Sheriff Breckinridge attended in a sentimental capacity and told everyone it was a fine thing, which it was. Louise wore a dress she had made from deep blue cotton, which was not white but which suited her coloring and her character considerably better, and she carried the blue and gold columbines from the creek because she had not forgotten the morning he had left them on the windowsill, and she never would. Harlan wore his clean clothes and had shaved and looked at her when she came through the church door with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, which was the expression of a man who has not expected to arrive somewhere this good, and is humbled and grateful and entirely present. Reverend Calloway pronounced them husband and wife. Cobb whooped. Mrs. Holt smiled in a controlled and dignified way that nevertheless had warmth in it. Sheriff Breckinridge blew his nose into his handkerchief. Louise and Harlan stood together in the September afternoon light, and she held her columbines, and he held her hand, and the future was open in front of them like the wide Texas sky. The early months of their marriage had the particular quality of two people learning each other in the new and more intimate terms that marriage allows. They discovered each other in the morning light, and in the long evenings, and in the small daily exchanges that accumulate into a life. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both people of strong opinion and clear convictions, and when they disagreed it was with a directness that neither of them had to apologize for after the fact. He learned that she was fiercely protective of her independence, that she needed to be asked and not directed, that she could work herself into exhaustion if not gently redirected, and that the best way to reach her when she was angry was to listen rather than to explain. She learned that he carried his dark past like something physical, that it surfaced in him sometimes at odd hours as a heaviness that he was still learning to put down, that he needed to be told he was good when he did not believe it himself. She told him because it was true. She told him often and without embarrassment because she had watched him be patient and honest and hardworking and kind with Cobb and with the animals and with her and with strangers in town, and she had formed her own careful judgment of his character, and it was a good judgment. "I am not a good man," he had said to her in the lantern light with her gun against his chest, which felt like a lifetime ago now, and she had lowered the gun and said, "I will be the judge of that." She had judged. She stood by the verdict. In November, the federal court insent. Louis convicted Vernon Cade on 7 counts including fraud, conspiracy, and responsibility for the deaths of 3 men in the Aldgate derailment. The sentence was significant. Harold Marsh sent a formal letter to Harlan with the news, and with the enclosed documentation of the full dismissal of all charges, signed and stamped and official. It was the pardon by another name, and it was real. Harlan read the letter at the kitchen table, and then he folded it carefully, and he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table and his head bowed, and Louise saw his shoulders rise and fall with one very long breath. She came to him and put her hand on the back of his neck, and he reached up and covered her hand with his. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. They had their first real fight in December, which was about the well cover and seemed to be about the well cover and was actually about something much older and harder for both of them. She had come out in the early morning to find the well cover improperly replaced after he had drawn water the night before, and she had said something sharp about it, and he had responded with a defensiveness that surprised her. And within 5 minutes they were both saying things that were adjacent to the real things without being the real things. She stopped herself mid-sentence and said, "We are not actually talking about the well cover." He stopped. He ran a hand through his hair. "No," he said. "What are we actually talking about?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm afraid of failing you. That is what is underneath everything when I am being sharp or defensive. I'm afraid that I will make some mistake that I cannot fix and that you will realize you were wrong about your judgment of me." She looked at him steadily. "And I," she said, "am afraid of being dependent. I have been on my own a long time and I have survived it by being thoroughly self-sufficient. And sometimes when I am sharp about small things, it is because I am being sharp about my own fear of needing you too much." They looked at each other across the December morning air, and it was one of those moments of complete honesty that are uncomfortable and entirely necessary. "We should probably talk about things like this," he said. "Yes," she said. "We probably should." They replaced the well cover together and went inside for coffee and talked about it, really talked about it, with the careful directness that both of them were capable of when they were not in their own way. In early spring of 1883, Louise missed her monthly cycle. She told Harlan on a Tuesday morning while he was in the barn, and she told him without preamble, which was her way, standing in the barn doorway and saying, "I believe I may be expecting a child." He had been carrying a saddle, and he put it down with a care that seemed to be about giving himself a moment to process, and then he turned to her with an expression that was so open and undone with feeling that it made her breath catch. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not yet, but I think so. I will know more in a few weeks." He crossed the barn to her and he took her hands in his and he looked at her with everything in his eyes that was not always in his face. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tell me truthfully." "Frightened," she said. "Happy, mostly frightened because there are a great many things that can go wrong and I do not have the luxury of being naive about that." She paused, "but also very happy." "I will be here," he said, "for everything, for every part of it." "I know," she said. The pregnancy was confirmed by the doctor in Caldwell Creek, a young man named Dr. Fielding who had arrived the previous autumn and who was competent and kind. He gave Louise the relevant information and told her she was healthy and in good condition for it, and she thanked him and went home and allowed herself a private moment of enormous, terrifying joy. The summer of 1883 was the most beautiful of Louise's life, and she knew it even while she was living it, which she was grateful for. The wheat field was producing well. The kitchen garden was in its best form yet. She was carrying their child with the particular physical grace that some women have, uncomfortable in some ways and radiant in others. And Harlan watched her with a tenderness that was so consistent and so specific that she sometimes had to look away from it, because it was almost more than she knew how to hold. Cobb Aldersley had moved on in the spring to take up his own small claim north of town, and they had replaced him with a hand named Emilio Torres, a 24-year-old man of Mexican descent, whose family had ranched in that part of Texas for 3 generations, who knew the land and the seasons in a way that was deeply valuable, and who was quiet and competent, and eventually became a genuine friend to both of them. Louise and Harlan sat on the porch in the evenings of that summer and watched the light change over the hills and talked about everything and nothing, and were content in a way that both of them had stopped expecting to be, and were grateful for having arrived at anyway. In late September, the letter arrived from the Missouri court. It was addressed to Harlan, and the return address was a law office in Kansas City. He opened it at the kitchen table while Louise was cutting bread, and she heard him make a sound that was not quite a word. "What is it?" she said. "My father," he said. He looked up from the letter with an expression that was complicated with old pain. "He died in July. The letter took a long time to reach me." He paused. "He left me something. A piece of land in Missouri, the original farm. I had thought it was gone. He must have managed to hold onto a portion of it." "I am sorry about your father," she said, setting down the bread knife and coming to him. "We were not close," he said, which was true but which did not prevent it from hurting. "I had not seen him in 9 years. She sat beside him and he showed her the letter. The land was modest, 20 acres in the Missouri Hill Country, likely overgrown and unworked, but it was real and it was his. "What do you want to do with it?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he said. "Maybe nothing. Maybe sell it eventually." He folded the letter. "But it feels like something, like a door that was closed for a very long time that has been left slightly open." She took his hand and held it, and he was quiet for a while, and she let him be quiet. The baby was born on the 28th of October, 1883, in the bedroom of the Caldwell Creek farmhouse, with Dr. Fielding in attendance and Mrs. Holt present in the supporting capacity of an experienced mother of 5 who would not be put off by Louise's insistence that she did not need fussing over. It was a boy. He was born just past midnight with a remarkable degree of force and volume, which Dr. Fielding said was an excellent sign, and which Mrs. Holt confirmed with the authority of experience, and which Harlan, who had been kept in the kitchen by firm instruction, and who had spent 4 hours in a state of barely controlled anxiety, received with an expression of such pure and overwhelming relief and joy when they brought him in that Louise, exhausted and aching and entirely clear-headed, felt something move in her chest that she did not have a word for, which was the feeling of a life being exactly right. They named him Thomas for her father. Thomas Sutton arrived in the world with a full head of dark hair, and a set of opinions about everything that expressed themselves at considerable volume for the first several weeks of his life. He settled into relative contentment once it became clear that he was going to be consistently and attentively cared for, and he looked up at his parents from his cradle with dark eyes that were Harlan's and a determined set to his small jaw that was unmistakably Louise's. Harlan held his son with a carefulness that was almost comical given the physical scale of him, a careful, reverent carefulness that gradually gave way to a natural ease as Thomas grew, and Louise watched this and felt the fullness of it completely and without reservation. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was cold, and the work was hard, and the baby was demanding, and they were both exhausted on a level that felt structural, and it was fine. It was fine because they were doing it together, and because the exhaustion was the exhaustion of something being built, and because at the end of the coldest nights when the fire had burned down and the baby was finally asleep and they were curled together in the warmth of their bed, Harlan would say, very quietly, "We are doing well," and she would say, "Yes, we are," and that was enough. In the spring of 1884, with Thomas 6 months old and beginning to show the considerable personality that would define him, a visitor came to Caldwell Creek who nobody had been expecting. His name was James Sutton, and he was Harlan's younger brother, 28 years old and recently arrived from Missouri, lean and dark like his brother but with a more open face and a ready grin. He arrived with a letter from the Kansas City law office, informing Harlan that as the sole heir he had decisions to make about the Missouri land, and James had come in person partly to help with those decisions, and partly, it became clear over the first evening's supper, because he had not seen his brother in nearly a decade, and had spent a significant portion of that time not knowing whether Harlan was alive. Louise watched the two brothers across the supper table, the careful circling of two people reconnecting after a long estrangement, the things said and the things not said, and she felt for Harlan the particular tenderness one feels when someone they love is healing from something old. After supper, when she had put Thomas to bed and come back to the kitchen, the brothers were sitting with coffee and the particular looseness of two people who had begun to find their way back to each other. James looked at Louise with an expression of frank appreciation, not of an inappropriate kind, but of the kind that said he was taking her measure and finding it very good indeed. "I am glad he has you," James said. "I am glad to have him," Louise said simply. James stayed 2 weeks. In that time Harlan made his decision about the Missouri land, which was to hold it for now, to let it sit while there was still too much here to justify dividing his attention. James understood this and agreed to look in on the property occasionally as part of his work, since he had taken to traveling and doing occasional legal work of a legitimate and documented kind. When James left, the two brothers embraced in the way of men of their era and region, which was briefly and without excessive demonstration, but Harlan watched him go with an expression that was quiet and settled and at peace. "Family," Louise said beside him. "Something like that," he said. "Something that might be that again." She took his arm and he put his hand over hers and they went inside. The summer of 1884 brought with it a new development in Caldwell Creek's fortunes. The railroad, the legitimate branch of it that was not connected to any of Cade's fraudulent operations, had been surveyed for an extension south through the hill country, and the survey line went within 4 miles of Caldwell Creek. There was talk of a spur line, of a station, of the possibility that this half-mud and half-ambition town might become a real and permanent thing on the map of Texas. It meant that land values were going to shift. It meant decisions to be made. Louise, who had a practical and clear-eyed relationship with money and property, spent several evenings with the deed to the 40 acres and the survey maps and a set of careful calculations. "Should not sell," she said. "I agree," said Harlan, "but we should expand if we can. The north section of the Perkins property has been sitting empty for 2 years and the bank note on it is in default. If we could acquire it before the railroad news drives the price up." He looked at the maps. "That would be 40 additional acres, and an existing well and a reasonable irrigation ditch. What would it cost?" They talked about money, the real and specific kind, with the ledgers open on the table. They had more than she had arrived with, considerably more, which was the result of 2 years of careful work and good decisions. It would require a loan, but a modest one, and Mrs. Holt at the general store had mentioned quietly that the bank in Abilene was doing favorable business with local property owners ahead of the railroad survey, which suggested it was a good moment. 3 weeks later, the Sutton farm was 80 acres. Thomas learned to crawl that August with tremendous purposefulness, and immediately applied himself to reaching everything that was not for reaching, which kept both his parents and Emilio Torres busy in a way that was genuinely exhausting and absolutely entertaining. He had a laugh that filled the room and hands that were never still, and he regarded the world with a curiosity that was entirely his own and that made Louise feel, every single day, the specific joy of watching a person arrive into themselves. "He is fearless," Harlan said one evening, watching Thomas haul himself to standing against the side of the woodbox with a determination that was almost alarming. "He comes by it honestly," Louise said. Harlan looked at her. "Which side?" She raised an eyebrow. "Both," she said. He smiled at her, that full and free smile that she still found just as transforming as she had that first time in the garden, and she smiled back. In the autumn of 1884, Sheriff Breckinridge announced his intention to retire from office. His knee had become something of a significant ongoing problem, and his wife, a patient and sensible woman named Ada, had been encouraging a move to Abilene to live near their daughter for some years. The town needed a new sheriff. There was discussion about this in Caldwell Creek, which was now a considerably livelier place than it had been 2 years earlier, with two new families having come in on the expectation of the railroad, a new blacksmith shop, and an expansion of the Dusty Anchor that Mrs. Holt continued to regard with a skeptical expression that she did not elaborate on. Several names were put forward. After a considerable amount of civic deliberation, a name emerged from the deliberation that surprised both of the people most directly concerned with it. Emilio Torres, who had not been the one to suggest it, came to the farm one Thursday morning with an expression that suggested he was the bearer of genuinely unexpected news. "The town council has put a name forward for the sheriff's position," he said. "Whose?" said Harlan, who was mending a saddle on the porch. Emilio looked at him directly. "Yours." There was a considerable silence. "Mine," Harlan said. "You have a reputation in this town," Emilio said. "You have been here 2 years. People know what you are. They know you are fair, and they know you are capable, and they know you are the kind of man who does not look for trouble and does not back down from it when it comes. That is exactly what a sheriff in a growing town needs to be." Harlan looked at Louise, who was standing in the doorway having heard all of this. She looked back at him with an expression that was entirely neutral, which meant she had an opinion but was deliberately not applying pressure. "What do you think?" he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that it is entirely your decision, but I also think that Emilio is not wrong. There is the matter of my history," he said. "Which is documented and officially resolved," she said. "The dismissal is on record. Harold Marsh's letter is on record. The Cade conviction is on record." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I will talk to the council." He talked to the council. The council was made up of 7 men and 2 women who had heard about Harlan Sutton's history from various sources over the previous 2 years, because in a small town things are known, and what they had concluded from that history was that he was a man who had made serious mistakes, reckoned honestly with them, put himself at considerable personal risk to do the right thing, and had then spent 2 years being exactly the kind of neighbor and citizen that a town wants and needs. They elected him sheriff of Caldwell Creek by a vote of 7-2, with the 2 dissenting votes coming from a man named Prescott who didn't trust anyone born in Missouri, and an older woman named Mrs. Carver who had theological objections to reformed sinners in positions of authority, which Louise privately found a breathtakingly uncharitable theological position, but did not say so. Harlan Sutton was sworn in as sheriff of Caldwell Creek, Texas, on the 5th of November, 1884, with his wife and his 14-month-old son present, and he wore the badge with a seriousness and a humility that told Louise everything she needed to know about the kind of sheriff he was going to be. He was a good one. He was methodical and fair. He was not afraid, but he was also not aggressive, and the distinction mattered considerably in a town that was growing and that had the particular frictions that growth brings. He resolved disputes with the same careful directness he brought to everything. He maintained order with a consistent and even hand. He never drew his weapon when his voice would do, and his voice was very effective. The railroad spur arrived in March of 1885, and with it came the changes they had anticipated. New businesses, new families, a new and larger church. The Dusty Anchor expanded again, and a competing establishment called the Cattlemen's Rest opened at the other end of the main street, and there was briefly an energetic rivalry between them that generated a certain amount of noise and very little actual violence, because Sheriff Sutton made his expectations on the subject very clear to both proprietors on the first day the Cattlemen's Rest opened. Caldwell Creek was becoming a real town. Louise's 80 acres were doing well. She had hired a second hand by then, a quiet and reliable man named Pete Foreman who had been ranching in the area for years and who knew the land the way a reader knows a familiar book. She was managing the farm with an efficiency that had come from 3 years of hard learning, and she was also, with Mrs. Holt's quiet encouragement and partnership, involved in the organization of a supply cooperative that was intended to let the smaller farms in the area buy seed and equipment at better rates through collective purchasing. It was a practical and sensible idea that was ahead of its time in some respects, and that, when it came together in the spring of 1885, genuinely changed the economic situation of 12 farming families in the Caldwell Creek area. Louise wrote about it in her leather journal, which she had kept faithfully since her father had given it to her, and which was now almost full, and she thought about her father, who had told her that the frontier was still open, and that a woman with land and the will to work it could make her own life. He had been right. He had not known the half of what that life would contain, but he had been right. In the spring of 1885, she found out she was expecting again. She told Harlan in the evening, and this time he did not set anything down because he was not carrying anything, and he simply came to her immediately and held her with a completeness that said everything. "How are you feeling?" He asked, which was always his first question, and she loved him for it. "Happy," she said, "terrified in a different way this time because I know more specifically what it involves." He laughed against her hair. "That is fair." "I am also," she said, "very happy." The second pregnancy was different from the first in the particular way that the second experience of anything significant is different, more confident in some ways, more attentive in others, with a quality of conscious appreciation that the first time does not always have because the first time is too much about getting through it. She worked through the summer with her usual determination, managed a modification of her usual pace that she accepted as sensible rather than resenting as a limitation, and spent a good deal of her evenings sitting on the porch watching Thomas attempt increasingly ambitious physical feats in the yard while Harlan sat beside her, and they talked about the kind of life they were building. There was a conversation in the late summer of 1885 that she thought about for a long time afterward. He had come home from the sheriff's office with a quietness about him that was not his usual settled quiet but something more considered, and she had waited, because she knew him well enough to know when something needed to find its own way to the surface. They had finished supper and were on the porch in the long light, and Thomas was asleep inside, and the evening was warm and crickets were in the grass, and he said, "I had a situation today." "Tell me," she said. "There was a man. Came through on the afternoon train. Had the look of someone who has been on the road too long and has made some bad decisions about how to manage that." He paused. "He reminded me of myself. Not in the specifics, in the way he was carrying himself, like he was waiting to be identified and shut down." "What did you do?" "I bought him a meal," Harlan said, "and I told him there was work if he wanted it out at the Perkins place. Tom Perkins has been looking for a hand, and I told him that how a man's story goes depends considerably on the decisions he makes when there are other options available." Louise looked at him in the long light. "Did he take you up on it?" "I think he might," Harlan said. "He was going to sleep on it." She took his hand. "That was the right thing to do." "I do not know if it was," he said honestly. "I do not know if he will take it or if he will go on the road and end up in more trouble. I do not know if I read him right." "You gave him the option," she said. "That is all you can do. You cannot make the choice for him." "No," he said, "but you can make sure he knows the choice is there." She held his hand in the warm evening, and the crickets were singing, and somewhere inside the house, Thomas made a small contented sound in his sleep, and she thought about warnings and judgments, and the way a life can be entirely different depending on someone choosing to give you the benefit of a doubt you have not strictly earned. She thought about a barn in April of 1882, and a man on a dark bay horse and the careful, closed-off expression that had contained. She had eventually understood, something very much like hope. The baby was born in January of 1886, another boy, which arrived with slightly less drama than Thomas had but with no less personality. They named him Daniel, which was the name of Harlan's grandfather, a man Harlan had described as one of the genuinely decent people of his childhood. someone who had treated people fairly regardless of what the world around him said about how much fairness certain categories of person deserved. Daniel Sutton had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and a nature that expressed itself differently from Thomas from the very beginning. Where Thomas was expansive and vigorous, Daniel was observant and deliberate, watching everything from beneath those gray eyes with the particular thoughtfulness of a person who is absorbing information before drawing conclusions. He was going to take after Louise in the most specific way, and Harlan recognized this early and found it deeply wonderful. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had opinions about most things, regarded his new brother with an initial wariness that gave way to a proprietary affection that manifested as him bringing Daniel toys he was far too young for, and reporting to his parents on Daniel's various activities with the seriousness of an official spokesperson. "Daniel is awake," Thomas would announce, appearing at the bedroom door at hours that his parents found inconvenient. "Daniel is looking at things." "Thank you, Thomas," Harlan would say gravely. "That is very good to know." In the spring of 1886, a letter arrived from James Sutton in Missouri. James had been to see the Missouri property, the 20 acres that Harlan had been holding, and he wrote that it was in better shape than expected, that the land itself was good, and that he had a proposition. James had found himself less inclined to traveling than he had once been, which he attributed without much elaboration to a woman in Kansas City whose name was Ruth, and who appeared to have altered his perspective on the value of staying in one place. He was considering settling and wondering whether Harlan had any intention of using the Missouri land, because if not, James had a proposal regarding the purchase of it. Harlan discussed this with Louise over several evenings. "Do you want to keep it?" she asked. "I want to know how you feel about it," he said. "That is not an answer," she said, and he smiled. "I do not feel a pull toward it," he said honestly. "I thought I might when the estate was settled. I thought I might feel some need to go back and reclaim something." But he looked around at the kitchen, at the worn and beloved table, at the window that framed the hill country sky, at the sounds of their sons in the other room. "I do not feel like I am missing something. I feel like I am exactly where everything is." "Then tell James he can have the land," she said. He wrote James a generous response, and included in it a warm and entirely sincere invitation to bring Ruth to Texas when the opportunity arose. James wrote back with an enthusiasm that suggested this was a very likely and near-term possibility, and that Ruth was both a remarkable woman and entirely too good for me, which I tell her regularly, and she responds by saying she will be the judge of that. Louise read this aloud at the breakfast table and looked at Harlan over the letter. He looked back at her with those dark eyes and that expression that she had catalogued and treasured for 4 years, and he said, "I believe I have heard something like that before." "I believe you have," she said. She put the letter down and reached across the table, and he took her hand and held it, and Thomas was talking about something involving the barn cat, and Daniel was watching everything with those gray eyes, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window in the way it had on all the mornings of this life they had built, and Louise Graves, who was Louise Sutton now, but who was always most essentially Louise Graves, felt the full weight of it and held it gladly. She thought about the girl who had arrived on the overland stage with $37 and a pocket watch, and the deed to 40 stubborn acres. And she thought about everything that had been added since. The 80 acres and the wheat field and the cooperative and the 2 boys asleep in the next room. And the man across the table with the calloused hands and the dark eyes and the complicated history and the entirely uncomplicated heart. She thought about a cold lantern and a wanted poster, and a gun she had held steady and the words that had changed everything. And she thought that the truest thing she had ever said in her life was that she would be the judge of that. She had judged. She had been thorough and honest, and she had taken all available evidence into account, and the verdict had been unambiguous, and she was in the habit, when the occasion called for it, of being right. James Sutton and Ruth came to Caldwell Creek that summer, and Ruth turned out to be a tall, clear-eyed woman from Kansas City with a dry humor and a direct way of speaking that Louise found immediately and entirely agreeable. They stayed for 3 weeks, and in that time the four adults fell into an easy friendship that felt like it had been there for years waiting to be discovered. On the last evening of their visit, they sat on the porch as the sun went down over the Texas hills, and the night was warm and smelled of the land and the distant creek, and Thomas was finally asleep after having run himself comprehensively into the ground with the assistance of his enthusiastic Uncle James, and Daniel was on Louise's lap watching the stars come out with his typical solemn attention. "You have something here," Ruth said, looking out at the land. "We do," Louise agreed. "It did not come easy," Ruth said, with the perception of a woman who could read a history in what was not being said. "No," Louise said, "it did not." Harlan was beside her, his shoulder against hers, and she felt him smile without looking at him. "The best things rarely do," he said. Ruth looked at him, and then she looked at Louise, and she nodded once in the particular way of someone recognizing what they are looking at. James and Ruth went back to Missouri, and they would be married the following spring, and Harlan and Louise would make the journey north for the wedding because some things are worth the distance. The years settled in the way that good years do, with their ordinary texture of work and weather and children growing and seasons changing, with their occasional difficulties that were manageable because there were 2 people to manage them, and their frequent joys that were larger because there were 2 people to hold them. Thomas grew into a boy of 10 who had his mother's determination and his father's capacity for stillness, who could argue any position with vigor, and who could also sit with a fishing line in the creek for an entire afternoon without fidgeting, which seemed contradictory but was not. He had decided at the age of 9 that he was going to be a lawyer, which Louise received without surprise, and which Harlan received with the amused pride of a man who can see clearly where a thing comes from. Daniel grew into a boy of 8 who was more quietly complex, who read everything he could find, who had a gift for mathematics that seemed to come from neither parent in particular, but which expressed itself with a certainty that suggested it was entirely his own, and who had the specific quality of being genuinely interested in other people, which made him easy to love and also, Louise suspected, going to be remarkable in whatever direction he chose. In the summer of 1894, something happened that brought the hidden past back into the present one last time. A journalist named Frederick Hale came through Caldwell Creek on his way to San Antonio, working on a piece about the development of the Texas Hill Country for a newspaper out of Dallas. He was a young man, enthusiastic and thorough, and he had done his research, and in the course of talking to Sheriff Harlan Sutton about the town's growth and governance, he mentioned, with a journalistic casualness that did not fully disguise his awareness of its significance, that he had been reading about the Aldgate Railroad case of 1881 in the course of researching the period. Harlan received this with the equanimity of a man who had long ago made his peace with his history being public record. "I know about the case," Harlan said. "You were involved," Hale said, with that careful journalistic neutrality. "I was," Harlan said. "The court record is entirely available. My cooperation with the federal investigation, the dismissal of charges, and Vernon Cade's conviction are all documented. I am happy to direct you to the Austin federal office." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Sheriff, I am not looking to write a scandal piece," he said. "I am genuinely writing about the development of this region, and frankly, what interests me about your story is not the Aldgate case. It is what came after, a man with a complicated history who became a trusted public officer in a growing community. That seems to me to be a significant story about what this country is supposed to be about." Harlan looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "You should talk to my wife." Hale talked to Louise, who gave him the same careful and complete honesty she gave everything, and the piece he eventually published in the Dallas paper was titled Caldwell Creek, a town and a sheriff built on hard reckoning, and it was accurate in all its factual claims and fair in all its characterizations, and Harlan read it at the kitchen table and then put it down and said nothing for a moment. "You told him about finding the letters," he said. "And about Crest?" "Yes," she said. "And about the gun?" he said. "Yes," she said. It seemed relevant to the story. He looked at her across the table, and she could see the full range of everything in his expression, the complicated gratitude and the vulnerability and the love that was, 12 years in, as real and clear as it had ever been. "He put in the part about what you said," Harlan said, "the part about being the judge of it." "I know," she said. "I told him that specifically." "Why?" She thought about this honestly. "Because I think it is the truest thing that happened between us," she said. "Not what I said. What it meant. That giving someone the benefit of a doubt when they have not earned it is not naive, and it is not foolish, and it does not make you weak. It is a choice. It is a specific, deliberate, brave choice, and I wanted that to be in the record." He got up from his chair and came around the table to her, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her in the way he had been holding her for 12 years with a completeness that had never worn into habit, and he said against her hair, "I love you. I have told you this before, but I do not think it is possible to say it too often." "It is not," she agreed. "I am grateful for you every single day," he said. "Not for what you did, for what you are." She pulled back enough to look at him. "I love you too," she said. "I have since Dickens, and I am not inclined to stop." He smiled at her with that full and transforming smile, and she smiled back. And outside the window the Texas sky was as wide and open as it had always been, and their sons were somewhere on the property doing the things that boys do, and the 80 acres were green and real under the summer sun, and the life they had built was solid and warm and entirely theirs. In the evening they sat on the porch, as they had sat on the porch for 12 years, and the light came down over the hills in long gold lines, and Harlan put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they were quiet together in the way of two people who have talked enough and do not need to fill the silence, who have earned the silence. Thomas came out eventually and sat on the porch steps and told them about something interesting he had read about water rights law, which was currently his specific obsession. Daniel came and sat beside him and asked a clarifying question that demonstrated he had been following the earlier conversation through the window despite appearing to be otherwise occupied, which made both his parents smile. The four of them sat together in the last of the evening light while the crickets started up in the grass, and the stars came out above the hills, and the story of who they were and how they had come to be here was written in all the small particulars of it, in the words that had been said, and the choices that had been made, in a gun lowered 2 inches and a verdict that had been true, in columbines on a windowsill and evidence carried through the dark, and the long, patient, thorough work of building something worth building. Louise Graves had been the judge of it. She had judged well. And the verdict, all these years on, was exactly the same as it had been on that April evening in a lantern-lit barn, with the whole complicated and uncertain future still ahead of them and the whole necessary, courageous, deliberate choice still to be made. He was a good man. She was certain of it. She had always been certain of it, even before he was certain of it himself, which was the particular gift and the particular responsibility of loving someone accurately. She held his hand in the warm summer evening and looked out at the land they had worked and the sky they lived under and the boys who were theirs, and she was grateful for all of it, for every hard thing that had led to it and every good thing that had come from it. The night came in softly over Caldwell Creek, and the lamp was lit in the kitchen, and the world was large and full and present, and Louise Sutton was exactly where she had made herself to be.